19-year-old Clara was trembling at the altar, sold off to a scarred, towering mountain man to pay her father's gambling debts. The whole town pitied her, whispering she wouldn't survive the winter. But on their wedding day, the beast handed her a gift that brought the entire town to its knees. In the autumn of 1882, the booming mining town of Leadville, Colorado, was a place where fortunes were dug out of the dirt by day and lost over felt card tables by night. It was a harsh, unforgiving frontier, and no one knew that better than 19-year-old Clara Pendleton. Clara was a girl of quiet grace, possessing a sharp mind and a gentle spirit that starkly contrasted the mud-slicked streets and rowdy saloons of her home. Her mother had passed away of consumption when Clara was just a child, leaving her in the care of her father, Arthur Pendleton, a man whose love for the bottle was eclipsed only by his addiction to the faro tables. Arthur had once been a respected merchant, owning the largest dry goods store on Harrison Avenue, but the silver crash and his own relentless vices had bled the family dry. By October, Arthur owed over $4,000 to Beauregard Croft, the ruthless owner of the Golden Nugget Saloon. Croft was a man known for breaking fingers and burning down businesses when his ledgers weren't balanced. When Arthur couldn't pay, Croft offered a sinister alternative: hand over Clara to work in the upstairs rooms of the Golden Nugget, and the debt would be forgiven. Clara had eavesdropped on this conversation from the top of the stairs, her blood turning to ice. She had resolved to flee in the dead of night, to take her chances in the freezing wilderness rather than become Croft's property. But before she could pack a single bag, another man intervened. His name was Josiah Boone. Josiah was a phantom in Leadville, a massive, broad-shouldered mountain man who lived high up in the treacherous peaks of the Sawatch Range. He only came down to town twice a year to trade furs, timber, and gold dust for supplies. He stood 6'4", with a thick beard, hair the color of dark molasses, and a jagged, terrifying scar that ran from his left temple down to his jawbone, a souvenir. The locals whispered, from a grizzly bear he'd killed with a hunting knife. He wore buckskin and heavy canvas, smelled of wood smoke and pine, and rarely spoke a word. The townspeople were terrified of him. Mothers pulled their children inside when his heavy boots hit the boardwalk. They called him the Beast of the Sawatch. The morning after Croft made his threat, Josiah Boone walked into the Golden Nugget, slammed a heavy leather pouch of raw gold onto the bar, and bought Arthur Pendleton's debt in its entirety. But Josiah didn't do it out of the goodness of his heart, at least. That was what Arthur told his daughter. He bought the debt, Clara, Arthur had stammered, his hands shaking as he poured himself a glass of cheap rye in their crumbling parlor. But he wants you. He wants a wife to take up to that God-forsaken cabin. If you don't marry him, he'll let Croft take you, or worse, he'll kill me himself. You have to do this, Clara, for your own father. Clara had stared at the pathetic, trembling man who had raised her. Her heart broke, not just from fear, but from the utter betrayal. She was being traded like a sack of flour. At 19, her life was entirely out of her control, seized by a mountain savage because her father couldn't stop playing cards. The wedding was arranged for the very next morning at the small Methodist chapel at the edge of town. It was a grim, sunless Tuesday. The wind howled down from the mountains, biting through the thin fabric of Clara's borrowed gray wool dress. She didn't have a white gown. There was no money for one, and no time to make it. She stood at the altar, clutching a small, wilted bouquet of dried wildflowers provided by the minister's wife, Mrs. Agatha Cartwright, who looked at Clara with eyes full of overwhelming pity. The chapel doors groaned open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Josiah Boone filled the doorway. He was dressed in a dark, heavy woolen suit that looked uncomfortable on his massive frame. His wild hair had been slicked back, but it did nothing to soften the brutal reality of his scarred face or the heavy, calloused hands that hung at his sides. As he walked down the aisle, the floorboards creaked under his immense weight. He didn't look at the small crowd of morbidly curious onlookers, Mayor Jebediah Stone, the local blacksmith, Thomas Miller, and a few gossiping women who had come to watch the lamb be handed over to the wolf. Josiah's dark, piercing eyes were fixed entirely on Clara. She trembled violently as he stopped beside her. He was 1.5 feet taller than she was, casting a shadow that swallowed her completely. When Reverend Miller asked for the rings, Josiah reached into his pocket and produced a simple, heavy band of solid gold. He took Clara's small, shaking hand in his. His skin was rough, like bark, but his touch was shockingly steady. He slipped the ring onto her finger. "I do," Josiah said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in Clara's chest. When it was her turn, Clara could barely force the words past the lump of terror in her throat. "I do." There was no kiss. Josiah merely nodded to the Reverend, turned, and offered his arm to Clara. She took it, feeling the rock-hard muscle beneath his coat. As they walked out of the church, Clara locked eyes with her father one last time. Arthur was counting a stack of $20 gold pieces in the back pew, Josiah's final payment to ensure Arthur could leave town. Clara's stomach turned. She was truly alone now, the legal property of a man the whole town believed was a monster. The wagon ride out of Leadville was agonizingly silent. Josiah had a sturdy, custom-built buckboard pulled by 2 massive black draft horses. He helped Clara up onto the wooden bench with a terrifying ease, his large hands gripping her waist and lifting her as if she weighed no more than a rag doll. He handed her a thick, heavy buffalo robe. "Wrap up," was all he said. "It gets colder the higher we go." Clara pulled the heavy fur tightly around her shoulders, burying her face in the thick collar as the wagon jolted forward. They left the muddy, crowded streets of Leadville behind, crossing the Arkansas River and beginning the steep, winding ascent into the Sawatch Range. For the first few hours, Clara sat rigidly, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She kept stealing terrified glances at the giant sitting beside her. He held the leather reins with relaxed confidence, his dark eyes scanning the dense timberline. The jagged scar on his face was stark in the afternoon light, making him look fierce and untamed. She wondered what he would do to her once they reached the absolute isolation of his cabin. The local women had filled her head with horror stories. They said men who lived alone in the mountains for too long lost their humanity. They said she would be a slave, chained to a wood stove and forced to endure his brutal affections. As the elevation climbed, the air grew incredibly thin and piercingly cold. The dense pine forests closed in around them, casting long, dark shadows over the narrow wagon trail. The sun began to dip behind the massive peaks, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and charcoal. "We're almost there," Josiah rumbled, his voice startling her in the quiet wilderness. Clara simply nodded, too terrified to speak. They finally broke through a thick stand of blue spruce into a wide, high-altitude clearing. Clara gasped softly. She had expected a ramshackle, dirt-floored hovel, but the structure before her was a beautifully crafted 2-story log cabin. It was sturdy and expansive, with a deep wraparound porch and a massive stone chimney puffing fragrant pinon wood smoke into the twilight sky. Beside it stood a well-kept barn and a large corral holding 3 more beautiful horses. Josiah brought the wagon to a halt and hopped down. He came around to Clara's side and reached up. Hesitantly, she let him lift her down to the frozen earth. "Go inside," he instructed, gesturing to the heavy oak door. "It's open. I'll see to the horses." Clara walked up the steps, her legs feeling like lead. She pushed open the door and stepped into the warmth. The interior of the cabin took her breath away. It was spotlessly clean. The floors were polished pine, covered in thick, woven Navajo rugs. Bookshelves lined the far wall, packed tight with leather-bound volumes. A massive stone hearth dominated the center of the room, a fire already banked and glowing cheerfully. In the corner sat a meticulously carved wooden dining table, with a fresh kerosene lamp burning brightly. It didn't look like the lair of a savage. It looked like a home. Clara stood awkwardly by the door, still clutching her small cloth bag of belongings, until the door opened behind her. Josiah stepped in, carrying her small trunk on one shoulder as easily as a sack of feathers. He set it down near the stairs. He took off his heavy coat, revealing a flannel shirt stretched tight across his broad chest, and hung his hat on a peg. He looked at her, standing there shivering despite the warmth of the fire. He sighed, a heavy, tired sound. "You look like a cornered rabbit, Clara," he said quietly. Clara flinched. "I don't know what you want from me." Josiah walked slowly to the kitchen area, pumping water into a tin kettle and setting it on the cast-iron stove. "I want you to warm up. I want you to drink some tea. And then I want you to go upstairs and get some sleep." Clara blinked in confusion. "Upstairs? Where will you sleep?" "Down here," Josiah replied, not looking at her. "By the fire. The bed upstairs is yours."
"But we are married,"
Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "My father said—" Josiah spun around, his dark eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce anger that made Clara take a step back. But he didn't move toward her. He gripped the edge of the iron stove, his knuckles turning white. "Your father," Josiah said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low gravel, "is a coward and a liar. I didn't buy you, Clara, and I am not going to touch you." He turned back to the kettle, his massive shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath. "I paid that debt because I heard Beauregard Croft boasting in the Golden Nugget about what he was going to do to Arthur Pendleton's beautiful young daughter. I know what happens to girls who get taken to the upstairs rooms of that saloon. I couldn't let that happen. But the only way Croft would let the debt go, and the only way the law would keep him from coming after you, was if you were legally bound to someone else. Someone Croft wouldn't dare cross." Clara stared at his broad back, her mind spinning. "You saved me? I bought you time. And I bought you safety," Josiah corrected, pouring boiling water into 2 tin mugs. He handed her one. His large fingers brushed hers, rough but incredibly gentle. "You're safe here, Clara. No one comes up this mountain. You will have your own room. You will have food. You are free to read my books, ride the horses, do whatever you please. And when the snow thaws in the spring, if you want to leave and go back east, I will give you the money and put you on a train myself." Clara looked down at the steaming tea in her hands. The monster of the mountain, the beast the town whispered about, had sacrificed his own peace and a fortune in gold just to save a girl he didn't even know. "Why?" she asked, looking up at his scarred face. "Why would you do all that for me?" Josiah looked away, the firelight casting deep, sad shadows across the ruined side of his face. "Because a long time ago, someone should have done it for my sister, and they didn't." He walked over to a heavy wooden chest, pulled out a thick woolen blanket, and laid it out on the rug by the hearth. "Drink your tea, Clara. The stairs are right there. Lock the door if it makes you feel better. I won't be offended." As Clara walked up the wooden stairs to her room, she realized that everything the town of Leadville thought they knew about Josiah Boone was a lie. But what she didn't know yet was that Josiah had one more secret. A secret he had secured on the morning of their wedding. A gift that was waiting for the right moment to change her life forever. The winter of 1882 was merciless. For 5 grueling months, the Sawatch Range was locked in a fortress of ice and blinding white snow. Blizzards roared through the high mountain passes like freight trains, piling drifts so high they nearly covered the cabin's lower windows. Yet, inside Josiah Boone's home, Clara found a warmth she had never known in her father's house. The terrifying beast of Leadville proved to be a man of profound, quiet routine. Josiah woke before dawn, tending the fires, feeding the draft horses, and chopping wood, always ensuring the cabin was bathed in warmth before Clara even stirred. He respected her privacy completely, never ascending the stairs to her room, and he spoke only when necessary, his deep voice a gentle rumble that Clara slowly began to find comforting rather than frightening. As the weeks bled into months, Clara's paralyzing fear gave way to a restless curiosity. She began to take over the cooking, replacing his simple frontier stews with roasted venison, herb-crusted trout, and fresh-baked sourdough bread. Josiah never openly praised her, but she noticed he always took second and third helpings, a faint glimmer of appreciation in his dark eyes. One bitter January evening, with the wind shrieking against the heavy timber walls, Clara pulled a worn, leather-bound copy of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities from Josiah's extensive bookshelf. "Would you mind if I read aloud?" she asked hesitantly, taking a seat in the rocking chair opposite his place on the hearth rug. Josiah paused, a piece of harness leather and an awl in his massive hands. He looked at her, his scarred face illuminated by the flickering firelight. "I haven't heard a voice read those words in a long time," he said softly. "I would like that." That night established a new rhythm. Clara read to him every evening, and in return, Josiah began to teach her the ways of the mountain. When the storms broke, leaving behind days of blinding, crystal-clear sunlight, he strapped snowshoes to her boots and taught her how to track snowshoe hares. He placed a heavy, beautifully engraved Winchester rifle in her hands, patiently standing behind her, his large hands guiding her arms until she could hit a pine cone from 50 yards away. Clara changed. The pale, terrified girl who had trembled at the altar vanished. She grew strong, her cheeks flushed with the high-altitude air, her hands calloused but capable. She no longer hid under the heavy buffalo robes. She walked the snowy perimeter of the cabin with her head held high, and as she changed, so did her perception of the man she had been forced to marry. She saw the immense gentleness in the way he handled a newborn foal in the barn. She saw the profound sadness that haunted his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. One evening, in late February, as she was bandaging a deep splinter he had pulled from his palm, her fingers accidentally brushed the jagged scar on his cheek. Josiah flinched, pulling away as if burned. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, her hand hovering in the air. Josiah stared into the fire, his jaw tight. "It wasn't a bear," he said suddenly, his voice thick with an emotion she hadn't heard before. "The scar. The town likes to say it was a grizzly." "It wasn't." Clara remained completely still, hardly daring to breathe. "What was it?" "A broken whiskey bottle," Josiah replied, his eyes dark and distant. "Held by the man who was beating my older sister Mary. We were living in a mining camp down near San Juan. She was married to a monster. I tried to pull him off her. He slashed my face to the bone. I was just a boy. I wasn't strong enough to stop him. She died 3 days later." He looked at Clara, the agonizing guilt written across every line of his face. "That is why I couldn't leave you to Beauregard Croft. I couldn't be too weak to stop a monster a second time." Tears pricked Clara's eyes. Without thinking, she reached out and gently laid her hand over his rough, scarred cheek. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch with a vulnerability that broke her heart. In that quiet, breathless moment, Clara realized she was falling deeply in love with her husband. But a shadow hung over their domestic peace. Every few weeks, a grizzled Ute scout named Caleb braved the treacherous passes to deliver heavy, wax-sealed envelopes to Josiah. They were sent from a prominent attorney in Denver, Judge Harrison. Whenever Josiah read these letters, his demeanor shifted to one of cold, calculating intensity. He would spend hours at the wooden table, writing responses and signing thick legal documents, which Caleb would then ferry back down the mountain. "Are you in some kind of trouble, Josiah?" Clara asked one evening, watching him seal another thick envelope. Josiah looked up, a rare, dangerous smirk playing on his lips. "No, Clara, I am not in trouble, but a few men in Leadville are about to be. April finally arrived, and with it came the great thaw. The snowpack melted into rushing silver streams, and the mountain exploded in vibrant shades of green and wildflowers. True to his word, on a bright Tuesday morning, Josiah hitched the black drafts to the buckboard wagon. "Pack your trunk, Clara," he said, standing by the door. "The passes are clear. It's time to take you down to town. It's time for you to go east, if that's what you want." Clara's heart plummeted. She hadn't packed her trunk. She didn't want to go east. But before she could confess her feelings, Josiah walked over and handed her a large, heavy leather portfolio. "I promised you a wedding gift," Josiah said, his voice dropping to a low, serious timbre. "I couldn't give it to you on the day we married, because it took the winter to secure. You are going to need this when we get to Leadville." The descent into Leadville was starkly different from the journey up. The air grew warmer, thick with the smell of coal smoke, mud, and cheap whiskey. When Josiah's heavy wagon rolled onto Harrison Avenue, the bustling street practically ground to a halt. The townspeople stopped in their tracks, their mouths dropping open. They had expected Clara Pendleton to be dead, buried in a shallow, frozen grave, or at the very least, broken and unrecognizable. Instead, she sat tall and radiant on the wagon bench beside the beast of the mountain. She was dressed in a stunning, deep emerald riding habit that Josiah had secretly ordered for her from a catalog, her hair pinned up elegantly, a gleaming Winchester rifle resting casually across her lap. She looked nothing like a victim. She looked like a queen of the frontier. Mayor Jebediah Stone nearly dropped his cigar as the wagon passed. Mrs. Agatha Cartwright, sweeping the steps of the chapel, crossed herself in pure shock. Josiah didn't stop at the train station. He drove the wagon straight to the center of town, bringing the massive draft horses to a halt directly between the Golden Nugget Saloon and the boarded-up storefront of Arthur Pendleton's former dry goods store. A crowd quickly formed, whispering frantically. The saloon doors swung open, and Beauregard Croft stepped out onto the boardwalk. He was a slick, dangerous-looking man in a pinstripe suit, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of Josiah and Clara. Behind him, emerging from the shadows of the saloon like a beaten dog, was Clara's father, Arthur. "Well, well," Croft sneered, stepping to the edge of the boardwalk, resting a hand on the pearl-handled revolver at his hip. "The mountain man brings his pet back to civilization. Get tired of her already, Boone?" Josiah didn't say a word. He stood up, towering over the crowd, and jumped down into the muddy street. He walked around to Clara's side and offered her his hand. She took it, stepping down gracefully, her fingers gripping the heavy leather portfolio he had given her that morning. "Go ahead, Clara," Josiah said, his voice carrying easily over the hushed crowd. "Open your wedding gift." Clara unclasped the leather flap and pulled out a thick stack of official watermarked documents bearing the seal of the state of Colorado and the signature of Judge Harrison. She read the top page, her eyes widening in absolute disbelief. Her hands began to shake, not from fear, but from the sheer staggering magnitude of what she was holding. "What is this?" she whispered, looking up at Josiah. "Read it aloud," Josiah commanded, his dark eyes locking onto Beauregard Croft. Clara cleared her throat, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "It is a deed of transfer. By order of the First National Bank of Denver, the mortgages and debts pertaining to the Golden Nugget Saloon and the property at 412 Harrison Avenue have been purchased in full." Croft's smug smile vanished instantly. His face went chalk white. "That's a lie," he spat. "My properties are mortgaged through Denver, yes, but no one up here has the capital to buy those notes." "I do," Josiah rumbled, stepping forward. The sheer physical presence of the man made the crowd instinctively shrink back. "I spent the winter having my attorney in Denver quietly purchase every single one of your outstanding debts, Croft. You over-leveraged yourself trying to build a gambling empire, and the bank was all too happy to sell your paper to me for solid mountain gold." Josiah turned to Clara, a fierce, protective light in his eyes. "Those deeds are in your name, Clara. As of this morning, you own the Golden Nugget Saloon. And you own your father's dry goods store. They are your property, to do with exactly as you see fit." The entire town of Leadville stood in stunned, paralyzed silence. The beast of the mountain hadn't just saved the girl. He had handed her the keys to the town. Arthur Pendleton stumbled forward, his hands trembling. "Clara, my girl," he wheezed, a pathetic, greedy light in his eyes. "You own my store? Oh, thank the Lord. We can rebuild. We can—" "Stop right there," Clara snapped, her voice like the crack of a whip. The Winchester rifle in her other hand shifted just slightly, but it was enough to freeze her father in his tracks. She looked at the man who had sold her to a monster to pay for his gambling, and then she looked at Croft, the predator who had tried to consume her. "Mr. Croft," Clara said, her voice dripping with ice, "you have until sundown to pack your personal belongings and vacate my saloon. If you are still on my property by nightfall, I will have the sheriff arrest you for trespassing. And if you ever speak to me again, I will let my husband show you exactly how he got the scar on his face." Croft's hand twitched toward his gun. Before anyone could blink, Josiah drew a massive Colt revolver from his coat and leveled it directly at Croft's chest, the hammer clicking back with a sound that echoed like a cannon in the silent street. "I wouldn't," Josiah warned softly. Croft slowly raised his hands, his face twisted in humiliated fury, and backed away. Clara turned to her father. "As for you, Arthur, you are banned from the dry goods store. You are banned from the saloon. I will authorize a weekly stipend for your food and lodging at the boarding house at the edge of town, handled by the bank. If I catch you at a faro table, or if I smell liquor on your breath, the money stops forever." Arthur opened his mouth to argue, but the fierce, unyielding look in his daughter's eyes silenced him completely. He bowed his head and slinked away into the crowd. Clara stood in the center of the muddy street, a 19-year-old girl who had been traded like livestock just 6 months prior, now the wealthiest and most powerful woman in Leadville. The townspeople stared at her in awe. She turned to Josiah. He was watching her, his dark eyes filled with a profound respect. "The train leaves at noon, Clara," he said quietly, the gun now holstered. "Your ticket east is at the station. You have the deeds. You are a rich woman. You never have to see this town or me ever again." Clara looked at the muddy streets, the shocked faces of the people who had pitied her, and then up at the towering, scarred man who had given up a fortune to give her back her freedom. She walked up to him, right there in the middle of Harrison Avenue, and reached up, wrapping her arms around his thick neck. "I am not going east, Josiah Boone," she whispered fiercely against his chest. "I have a saloon to sell, a dry goods store to reopen, and a cabin in the Sawatch Range that I need to get back to. My husband is waiting for me there." Josiah's breath hitched. For the first time since she had met him, a genuine, blinding smile broke across his scarred face. He wrapped his massive arms around her, lifting her off the ground as the town of Leadville erupted into stunned whispers and scattered, disbelieving applause. The devil's bargain had been broken, and from its ashes, the legend of Clara and Josiah Boone had truly begun. The following weeks in Leadville were nothing short of a revolution. Clara Boone did not just take ownership of her properties. She commanded them with an authority that left the hardened miners and businessmen of the town entirely awestruck. Her first order of business was to liquidate the saloon. She had no desire to run a gambling hall, especially one with such a dark history. Instead, she arranged a meeting at the upscale Clarendon Hotel with none other than Horace A.W. Tabor, the real-life Silver King of Leadville, and his infamous, glamorous new wife, Baby Doe. Tabor, flush with millions from his matchless mine, was always looking to expand his real estate empire along Harrison Avenue. Expecting a naive, easily manipulated young girl, Tabor offered a fraction of the golden nugget's worth. Clara, sitting tall with Josiah standing silently behind her chair like a living mountain, calmly slid the paperwork back across the table. She systematically dismantled Tabor's lowball offer, citing the exact foot traffic, the value of the imported mahogany bar, and the prime location adjacent to the new opera house. By the time the meeting concluded, a stunned but deeply impressed Horace Tabor had written a check that made Clara one of the wealthiest private citizens in Lake County. With the capital from the sale, Clara completely renovated her father's former dry goods store. She stocked it with premium woolens, quality tools, and canned goods, hiring a respected local widow, Mrs.
Gable, to manage the day-to-day operations.
Leadville had finally accepted that the terrified girl sold to a beast was dead. In her place stood the fierce, untouchable queen of the Sawatch. But a wounded animal is the most dangerous kind, and Beauregard Croft was bleeding his last drop of pride. Croft had not left town. Humiliated and stripped of his empire, he had retreated to the squalid, dangerous shanty towns on the edge of the mining camps. He blamed Josiah for his ruin, but his true venom was reserved for Clara. He could not stomach the reality that a 19-year-old girl had bested him. Desperate and practically penniless, Croft formulated a final cowardly plot to destroy everything she had built. It happened on a moonless night in late May. Clara and Josiah were inside the newly renovated dry goods store, finalizing the inventory ledgers before their planned return to the mountain cabin the next morning. The streets of Leadville were eerily quiet, the usual rowdy saloon noise muffled by a thick, settling fog. Josiah suddenly stopped packing a crate of supplies. His broad shoulders tensed. He possessed the highly tuned senses of a man who had survived the absolute wilderness, and his dark eyes snapped toward the back alley door. "Josiah?" Clara whispered, noticing the shift in his posture. "Get behind the counter," he ordered, his voice a barely audible, deadly rumble. He drew his heavy Colt revolver, stepping seamlessly into the shadows of the storeroom. "Now, Clara." Before Clara could move, the shattering of glass violently broke the silence. A heavy glass bottle, stuffed with a blazing rag and filled with kerosene, flew through the front window. It smashed against the wooden floorboards, instantly erupting into a terrifying pool of fire. The front door was kicked open, and Beauregard Croft stepped into the burning light, a double-barreled shotgun in his hands. Flanking him were two grimy, hired enforcers with drawn pistols. And trembling behind them, reeking of cheap whiskey and pathetic desperation, was Arthur Pendleton. Croft had dragged Clara's father along to witness the destruction of the very store he had gambled away. "You took my life, Boone!" Croft screamed over the crackling flames, raising his shotgun. "Now I'm burning yours to the ground!" Josiah lunged from the shadows with terrifying speed. He fired twice, dropping the first hired gun instantly. But the movement exposed his position. Croft swung the shotgun and pulled the trigger. The deafening blast tore through the air, and Josiah was thrown violently backward into a display of heavy canvas sacks, his left shoulder blooming with dark crimson blood. "Josiah!" Clara screamed. Croft laughed, a manic, unhinged sound, as he pumped the shotgun to reload, stepping over the spreading flames toward the fallen mountain man. "I'm going to mount your scarred head on a wall, Boone, and then I'm taking the girl." Croft never saw it coming. Clara did not cower. She did not freeze. The endless winter hours of Josiah standing behind her, patiently adjusting her grip and teaching her to breathe through the cold, took over completely. She dropped to her knees behind the heavy oak counter, her hands frantically grasping the beautifully engraved Winchester rifle Josiah had left, leaning against the till. She stood up, ignoring the intense heat of the flames licking at the floorboards. She leveled the heavy barrel, resting her cheek against the walnut stock, her eyes icy and perfectly focused. Crack. The rifle fired. The bullet shattered Croft's right kneecap. He shrieked in absolute agony, dropping the shotgun as he collapsed onto the floorboards. The second enforcer raised his pistol toward Clara, but she racked the lever of the Winchester with lightning speed and fired again, blowing the gun clean out of the man's hand. The enforcer turned and fled into the night. Arthur Pendleton fell to his knees in the street, sobbing uncontrollably at the sheer, terrifying power his daughter now wielded. Clara didn't spare her father a second glance. She dropped the rifle and ran to Josiah. The massive man was already pushing himself up, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his dark eyes wide with astonishment. He looked from the writhing Croft to the smoking rifle, and then to his wife. "I told you," Clara breathed, tearing a strip of fabric from her skirt to press against his wound, her hands shaking but her voice steady. "I'm not letting any monsters hurt you either." By the time Mayor Stone and the local sheriff arrived, the fire had been stomped out. Croft was dragged away in chains, destined for the territorial prison, where his remaining days would be spent breaking rocks. Arthur Pendleton was unceremoniously loaded onto a dawn freight train headed out of Colorado, permanently exiled by the town authorities who had finally seen enough of his treachery. 2 days later, with Josiah's arm in a sling but his spirit lighter than it had been in a decade, the Boones loaded their wagon. They left the buzzing, bustling town of Leadville behind them, the dry goods store safely in Mrs. Gable's hands. As the black draft horses began the steep ascent back into the majestic, pine-covered peaks of the Sawatch Range, Clara leaned her head against her husband's uninjured shoulder. She wasn't a piece of property, and he wasn't a beast. They were equals, forged in the frozen crucible of the frontier, heading home. Clara's phenomenal journey from a terrified pawn to the fierce, untouchable queen of the Sawatch Range proves that sometimes the greatest love stories are forged in the harshest winters. Josiah's wedding gift didn't just buy a town, it bought a lasting legacy of freedom. If you loved this Wild West tale of revenge, redemption, and unexpected romance, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life frontier stories.
Hi, my name is Ensley Rowland, the owner and manager of Air Encounters. After watching the video, forced to marry at 19, she feared her husband until his wedding gift stunned the entire town. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the journey from fear to trust. The story reminds us that people are not always what they seem at first glance, and sometimes understanding someone's true character takes time. Watching expectations slowly give way to respect and hope made this story especially engaging. One gentle lesson I took from it is that kindness and actions often speak louder than assumptions. In our own lives, taking the time to understand someone before judging them can lead to meaningful relationships and unexpected blessings. What moment in the story surprised you the most? And do you think the wedding gift changed her perspective instantly, or was it only the beginning of that change? Thank you for spending time with Air Encounters. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and maybe like or subscribe for more heartfelt stories like this.